my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that my Republican colleagues believed in freedom. Well, collective bargaining essentially is the freedom to negotiate the best possible work environment to allow these public employees to continue to deliver services that are effective and efficient for the American people. And yet, instead of focusing on driving down the high cost of living in America, which is out of control, yes, there is an affordability crisis in the United States of America, notwithstanding the fact, Mr. Speaker, that Donald Trump apparently believes it's a hoax. The American people know it's not a hoax. Instead of focusing on trying to find common sense solutions to make life better for the American people, Donald Trump and my Republican colleagues continue to just jam their extreme ideology down the throats of the American people while working overtime.
You just witnessed Representative Hakeem Jeffries standing on the House floor delivering what can only be described as a moment of moral reckoning, a thunderclap of truth so visceral and necessary that it cuts through the malignant fog of Republican doublespeak like a scalpel through necrotic tissue. And I need you to understand right now, before we even begin to unpack the profound implications of what just transpired, that this is not merely about collective bargaining, or executive orders, or even the grotesque theater of Trump calling the affordability crisis a hoax, while ordinary Americans drown in debt and desperation, because what Jeffries articulated with surgical precision is nothing less than the complete intellectual and moral bankruptcy of the contemporary Republican project, a party so thoroughly captured by oligarchic interests and so utterly bereft of genuine concern for working people that they have abandoned even the pretense of ideological consistency in favor of raw plutocratic power. And you need to keep watching, because what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally reshape how you understand the constitutional crisis unfolding before our eyes. Jeffries identified them as one or two puppet masters who dictate to extreme MAGA Republicans who do the bidding of the wealthy, the well-off, the well-connected millionaires and billionaires, and this language is not hyperbole, but rather a precise diagnostic assessment of the material conditions of American democracy in this terrifying moment, because when you examine the actual mechanics of contemporary Republican governance, what you discover is a party apparatus functioning essentially as a legislative shell corporation for the extraction of wealth upward and the redistribution of misery downward, and the collective bargaining fight that Jeffries references here is paradigmatic of this entire hideous enterprise, because understand this fundamental truth that Republicans wrap themselves in the rhetoric of freedom while systematically dismantling the very institutional arrangements that allow working people to exercise meaningful freedom in their economic lives. Trump has already revived Schedule F, which aims to reclassify tens of thousands of workers to make them easier to fire, and critics say it's an attempt to strip apolitical workers of their rights and ultimately replace them with Trump loyalists. And this is happening right now in December 2025, while we speak, with Trump's March executive order stripping collective bargaining rights from roughly 1 million federal workers. And wait, because here comes the bombshell that will absolutely electrify you. Just yesterday, nearly 24 House Republicans joined Democrats to pass legislation that would restore these collective bargaining rights in a bipartisan 231-195 vote, using a discharge petition to bypass GOP leadership, which means that even within the Republican caucus, there are members who recognize that what Trump has done represents such a flagrant assault on worker dignity and constitutional norms that they cannot in good conscience support it. Think about the philosophical architecture of what Republican Trumping here, because when Jeffries speaks about collective bargaining as the freedom to negotiate the best possible work environment, he is articulating a conception of liberty that the right wing has spent decades trying to obliterate from public consciousness, this positive liberty framework that understands freedom not merely as the absence of state interference, but as the substantive capacity to exercise meaningful agency over the conditions of one's existence. And this connects directly to the Republican small r tradition of civic republicanism that understood concentrated private power as every bit as threatening to human flourishing as concentrated state power, a tradition that conservatives have systematically betrayed in their embrace of what can only be called corporate feudalism, dressed up in the costume of free market ideology. Trump told crowds in Pennsylvania that affordability was a hoax perpetrated by Democrats, and his assertions dismissing inflation are not backed by official government economic data. And I want you to sit with the sheer audacity of this gaslighting for a moment, because what Trump is doing here is employing a rhetorical strategy that fascist movements have used throughout history, the mobilization of what Hannah Arendt called organized lying to destabilize the very foundations of shared reality, telling people who are experiencing material suffering that their suffering is imaginary while simultaneously claiming to be their champion against elites. And polling shows that 57% of voters believe Trump is losing the battle against inflation, while 68% in another survey expressed concerns about affordability, which means the American people, in their aggregate wisdom, can see through this transparently cynical performance. Now here is where this gets absolutely explosive, because Jeffries connects the dots that corporate media refuses to connect when he charges that Republicans are jamming their extreme ideology down the throats of the American people while working overtime to benefit your billionaire donors, because this massive tax cut agenda involving suspending the debt ceiling is designed to bring about a massive tax cut unpaid for wealthy donors and for wealthy corporations for millionaires and billionaires, and understand that this is not rhetoric but empirical description of legislative mechanics, with the objective being to pass massive tax cuts for billionaires, donors, and their wealthy corporations, and then to force working-class Americans to pay by slashing and burning things like Medicaid to the ground, which represents the most nakedly oligarchic policy agenda in American history, masquerading as populist economic nationalism. You need to understand the sheer scale of billionaire capture of the Republican Party because 150 of America's wealthiest families spent nearly $2 billion on the 2024 election cycle, $700 million more than in 2020, with Republicans being the biggest beneficiary, including families of Miriam Adelson, Elon Musk, and far-right activist Richard and Elizabeth Uelin, and 100 billionaire families donated $2.6 billion with 70% of their donations going to the GOP, which means that when Jeffries talks about puppet masters, he is speaking with mathematical precision about the material flows of capital that structure Republican decision-making. Jeffries explicitly identified Elon Musk as a billionaire puppet master who is directing House Republicans, which is not conspiracy theorizing, but rather straightforward observation of visible political dynamics. Let me take you deeper into the constitutional dimensions of this crisis, because what we are witnessing is the weaponization of executive power to dismantle the very institutional arrangements that allow for democratic contestation in the workplace. And wait, because this is where it gets even more sinister. Trump's executive orders have stripped away union rights for almost 500,000 federal workers, with 28 agencies ordered to comply with the removal of protections, and those orders have effectively removed most or all of these protections and benefits. And this has been called the largest loss of collective bargaining rights in U.S. history, representing nothing less than an authoritarian assault on the organizational capacity of working people to defend their interests against concentrated capital. Democratic Representative Jared Golden, who led the effort to restore collective bargaining rights, stated that President Trump said ending collective bargaining was about protecting our national defense, but in my district, many affected workers build our warships and care for our veterans. These workers make our country safer and stronger every day, which utterly demolishes the national security pretext that Trump deployed to justify this union busting, because the actual security threat comes not from workers organizing for better conditions, but from the systematic degradation of the federal workforce's morale and institutional capacity through union destruction, and Congresswoman Presley articulated this perfectly when she said Trump and Musk are attacking our labor unions because they don't want workers to have power. They know that an organized workforce is a threat to unchecked power, which is the fundamental truth that animates this entire conflict. Think about what it means that Jeffries frames this as Republicans attacking freedom while claiming to champion freedom, because this gets at the core ideological perversion of contemporary conservatism, which has transmuted a classical liberal concern with arbitrary power into a fundamentally anti-democratic project of dismantling all institutional constraints on capital accumulation, and collective bargaining represents precisely the kind of countervailing power that pluralist democratic theory from Tocqueville through the New Deal architects understood as essential to preventing oligarchic consolidation. So when Republicans attack unions, they are attacking not some special interest, but rather the very organizational infrastructure that makes popular sovereignty possible in conditions of massive wealth inequality. Trump in March revoked the Biden administration's order, reducing the allowable minimum wage on federal contracts to $13.30 per hour, and lowering the minimum wage by $9,256 per hour, and lowering the minimum wage by $9,256 per hour, and lowering. The administration cut minimum wage protections for hundreds of thousands of federal contract workers and halted plans to require companies to pay disabled workers at least $7.25 per hour, which means that the Trump administration is literally reducing legal protections that prevent employers from paying disabled workers below the already barbarically low federal minimum wage. And if that does not crystallize the moral obscenity of this project, then I don't know what possibly could. Now Jeffries charges that Trump believes the affordability crisis is a hoax, and this deserves unpacking, because Senate Republicans themselves are unsettled and want Trump to do more to respond to the issue of affordability, warning that the White House needs to do more to show voters it is working hard to ease financial burdens, with Senator Lisa Murkowski stating, "You can't call it a hoax and suggest that people are going to believe it. What you say matters." So even within Republican ranks there is recognition that Trump's denial of economic reality represents political malpractice of the highest order, and Trump's tariff policies that he claims will help workers have actually increased prices on a number of items, from food to clothing to furniture, with tariffs raising about $30 billion per month in revenue, which means working families are paying a $30 billion monthly tax to subsidize Trump's economic nationalism theater. The historical parallels here are absolutely chilling, because what we are watching is the deployment of executive authority to fundamentally restructure the balance of class power in American society, and this connects to a much longer reactionary project dating back to the Powell Memo and the organized business offensive against the New Deal regulatory state. But what distinguishes the current moment is the sheer brazenness with which Republicans are willing to violate democratic norms and constitutional constraints in service of oligarchic interests. Jeffries identified this hypocrisy perfectly when he noted, "For decades, the Republican Party has lectured America about fiscal responsibility, about the debt and the deficit. It's always been phony. This bill proves it, because deficit hawkishness was never about fiscal prudence, but always about manufacturing crises to justify dismantling social programs." Recent legislation represents the largest transfer of wealth from everyday Americans to billionaires in American history. These so-called fiscal conservatives are going to explode the debt by more than $3 trillion, which exposes the complete intellectual bankruptcy of conservative economic ideology, because the same people who claimed that we couldn't afford to extend enhanced ACA subsidies or provide student debt relief or maintain the expanded child tax credit that lifted millions of children out of poverty are perfectly happy to blow $3 trillion holes in the budget to shower tax cuts on people who already have more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. And this is not economics, but rather naked class warfare dressed up as fiscal policy. Let's talk about what Jeffries means when he says Republicans are jamming extreme ideology down the throats of the American people, because the language here is important. It evokes both violation and forced consumption, the sense that what is being perpetrated is fundamentally anti-democratic in its mechanisms regardless of electoral outcomes, and this connects to a crucial distinction in democratic theory between mere electoral majoritarianism and genuine popular sovereignty, which requires robust institutions for ongoing public deliberation and contestation, and when Trump governs through a tsunami of executive orders that circumvent deliberative processes, he is enacting a plebiscitary authoritarianism that hollows out democratic substance while preserving its formal shell. The legislation to restore collective bargaining rights effectively nullifies Trump's March executive order barring unions at more than 40 federal agencies under the guise of national security, and this required a months-long discharge petition drive to amass a majority of House lawmakers' support and force floor consideration, which demonstrates that even in a Republican-controlled House, there exists a bipartisan majority for protecting worker rights when representatives are allowed to vote their conscience rather than being whipped into submission by leadership, and this raises profound questions about the relationship between party discipline and democratic accountability in an era of negative partisanship and tribal political identities. Think about the Madisonian architecture of separation of powers and checks and balances, because what the founders understood was that concentrated power, regardless of its source, represented a threat to Republican liberty, and they designed a constitutional system premised on the idea that ambition would check ambition through interbranch competition. But what they could not have fully anticipated was the rise of political parties as extra-constitutional actors capable of coordinating action across branches to defeat the checking function, and in the current moment we are watching the catastrophic consequences of unified party government combined with the collapse of any meaningful Republican opposition to Trump's authoritarian impulses, creating conditions where executive overreach faces no institutional resistance except from the minority party and occasional defections by endangered Republicans in competitive districts. Florida's Republican legislature passed laws that resulted in 63,000 Florida workers had their unions decertified in the last year, accounting for an 11% decline in union density by creating impossible conditions where unions must prove 60% membership while simultaneously being prohibited from collecting dues through payroll deductions, creating a double whammy where Florida lawmakers thus set up a hurdle for unions that they then made it exceedingly difficult to clear. And this represents the kind of procedural authoritarianism that maintains democratic aesthetics while systematically destroying the capacity for collective resistance. And while a handful of Republicans in Washington have been talking about supporting unions, GOP leaders at the state level have been deploying their governing power to try and kill them, which reveals the utter cynicism of Republican populist cosplay at the national level. When Jeffries says Trump and Republicans continue to benefit your billionaire donors, he is articulating a materialist analysis of contemporary conservatism that understands ideological claims as always needing to be interrogated against the question of cui bono, who benefits. And when you follow the money, the answer becomes unmistakable, because top Republican donors include billionaire financiers, such as Kenneth Griffin, founder and CEO of hedge fund Citadel, Paul Singer, founder of Elliott Investment Management, Jeffrey Yass of Susquehanna International Group, and Stephen Schwartzman, CEO of Blackstone. And these are not ideological donors motivated by concern for working families, but rather calculating plutocrats, seeking to shape policy environments favorable to continued wealth extraction. The intersection of executive power and labor rights here demands deeper analysis, because what Trump is doing through executive orders represents an end run around not just Congress, but the entire framework of labor law that was painstakingly constructed over decades of struggle. Trump has used national security concerns to justify denying legally mandated rights in executive branch agencies, including the Department of Agriculture, most of the Treasury Department, and the Environmental Protection Agency, which shows how capaciously the national security exception can be deployed to nullify statutory protections, and this connects to the post-9/11 expansion of executive authority that legal scholars warned would eventually be turned against domestic populations once the precedents were established. Members of the Congressional Lowering Costs Caucus responded to Trump's affordability hoax claim by stating, "The affordability crisis is real, and it is crippling the American dream. The only people who don't realize that are the out-of-touch billionaires that the president continues to put before American families." And this gets at something profound about the epistemological crisis of plutocratic governance, because when political leaders are so materially insulated from the conditions experienced by ordinary people, they literally cannot perceive economic reality. They exist in a bubble where, as Senator Murkowski noted, Trump is not sitting down on a Thursday night and paying his own bills and seeing what's going on with healthcare and how much his credit card shows for gas receipts, which means governance becomes increasingly detached from lived experience and responsive only to the demands of donor networks. Now we need to grapple with what collective bargaining actually represents in normative democratic theory, because it is not merely an economic arrangement, but rather a form of industrial citizenship that recognizes workers as bearing rights and dignities that cannot simply be abolished by managerial fiat. And the attack on public sector unions in particular represents an attack on the idea that government employment should model democratic workplace relations rather than reproducing the authoritarian hierarchies of private employment. As union leaders noted, for more than 6 decades, federal employees, including those working in national security contexts, have exercised collective bargaining rights without compromising readiness or mission success, which utterly demolishes the pretextual justification. Let me connect this to the broader crisis of American democracy, because what Jeffries is describing is not an isolated assault on worker rights, but rather one component of a comprehensive authoritarian project that includes voter suppression, gerrymandering, the corruption of election administration, the weaponization of state power against political opponents, and the systematic capture of judicial and regulatory institutions. And the common thread running through all of these is the recognition by Republican elites that their agenda cannot survive genuinely free and fair democratic contestation, so democracy itself must be hollowed out and replaced with what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism, where elections occur but under conditions so distorted by money and manipulation that outcomes are essentially predetermined. Jeffries supported the bill to restore bargaining rights, saying it would help public servants who have been targeted viciously by the Trump administration from the very beginning of his time in office. And this framing is crucial, because it positions federal workers not as some special interest, but as public servants performing essential functions who are being targeted precisely because their unions represent organized centers of resistance to Trumpist transformation of the administrative state. And as Representative Presley articulated, unions have long been the backbone of this country, helping families thrive by winning better wages, benefits, and safer working conditions. Now more than ever, I'll keep standing with our siblings in the labor movement, which recognizes that the labor movement's fate and democracy's fate are inextricably linked. The philosophical stakes here involve competing visions of human freedom and social organization. Because the right-wing vision treats freedom as fundamentally individual and negative, the absence of constraint, and therefore sees any form of collective organization or state regulation as inherently freedom-reducing, while the progressive vision understands that meaningful freedom requires positive capacities and institutional supports, that a person facing destitution or employer domination is not free in any meaningful sense, regardless of the formal absence of state coercion, and collective bargaining represents an institutional arrangement that enhances worker freedom by creating countervailing power against employer domination, which is why its destruction serves authoritarian projects. Recent polling shows American consumers are feeling the squeeze, with a substantial number of Trump supporters holding the president responsible for rising prices, and a new Harvard Capps-Harris poll shows that affordability and inflation remain top concerns, with a majority of voters think Trump's tariffs are hurting the economy, which demonstrates that Trump's gaslighting about affordability being a hoax is failing because material conditions cannot be indefinitely denied through rhetorical manipulation, and this creates an opening for the kind of economic populism that Jeffries is articulating to gain political traction if Democrats have the courage to prosecute the case aggressively. What Jeffries accomplished in this clip was nothing less than moral witness, speaking truth about power with a clarity and force that refuses euphemism or false equivalence, and this is what democratic leadership looks like in an authoritarian moment: the willingness to name systems of domination and call out the collaboration of political actors with those systems. The fact that he connects worker rights to the affordability crisis to billionaire donor influence shows a systemic analysis that understands these are not separate issues, but manifestations of the same underlying dynamic of oligarchic capture, and this is the kind of analysis that must become central to democratic messaging if we are to have any hope of building the popular coalition necessary to defeat Trumpism and reconstruct democratic institutions. The tragedy and hope of this moment both flow from the same source, which is that the contradictions of contemporary conservatism are becoming too blatant to ignore, the gap between populist rhetoric and plutocratic governance too wide to paper over. And when Trump calls affordability a hoax while prices rise and wages stagnate, he creates conditions where even some Republicans recognize they cannot maintain this fiction, hence the 20 Republicans who sided with Democrats in a rare break from the president, which suggests that on certain issues where material interests align across partisan divides, there remains possibility for Democratic coalition building, but this requires Democrats to lean into class politics rather than retreating into technocratic managerialism or identity politics divorced from material struggle. The future will be determined by whether working people can be organized into a political force capable of challenging oligarchic power. The fight over collective bargaining is central to that project, because unions remain, despite their weakened state, the most significant institutions for translating working-class grievances into organized political power, and their destruction would leave workers atomized and powerless before capital, which is precisely why Republicans are so committed to finishing what they started with Taft-Hartley and right to work, and now are attempting to complete through the executive demolition of public sector bargaining. And Jeffries understands this, which is why he connects these struggles to the broader project of defending democracy itself, because democracy without economic democracy is merely the procedural shell without substantive content. This is the fight of our time, and Hakeem Jeffries just showed us what fighting back looks like.